We're now going to move on to our second keynote of the day from Dr. Taylor Ott, Becoming Friends with the Earth, an intersectional feminist approach to finding the divine in the world. Ooh. I've just lost my bio. There you go. So Dr. Ott is a postdoctoral research fellow at KU Leuven in Belgium. She's currently working on a project called Dissenting Church, which seeks to theorize the role that dissent plays in building ecclesial community. Her contribution to the project takes a critical theory approach to histories of dissent in the Roman Catholic Church, seeking neither to villainize nor valorize dissent, but to accept contestation as a normative part of human life and community, over and against the current Catholic approach of officially disallowing any public expression of dissent. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about that. However, that's not what she's presenting on. She earned her PhD in theological and social ethics at Fordham University in New York under the direction of Christine Farah-Henze, and her first book, titled Conflict and Catholic Social Ethics, an Interdisciplinary Approach, has been recently published with Routledge. So as I say today, we're not exploring dissent at all, but looking at becoming friends with the earth, an intersectional feminist approach. So Taylor, over to you when you're ready. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Yeah, as I guess my bio makes clear, that this is not the main thing that I do, but I've done, I'm an ethicist by training, and so I've done some work on ecological theology, so that's where this is coming from. All right. For the scientific community of the mid-20th century, humans were different in kind from non-human animals. Human beings made tools and set them apart from other animals. Humans had personalities, whereas other animals did not. Scientists should maintain objectivity by giving their animal subjects numbers rather than names, and they should not at any point develop empathy for their non-human animal subjects. Luckily, a young woman named Jane Goodall did not know these things, as she puts it. And so when she was sent to study the behavior of chimpanzees at Gombe in what is now Tanzania, she gave them names and developed a relationship with the whole group that she had spent months tracking, and with each chimp in particular. Because of this, she witnessed them making and using tools, showing care for each other, and exhibiting different personalities. Video evidence proved to the scientific community and to the world that the things we had assumed set us apart as humans, like making tools, were not actually unique to us humans after all. Goodall also writes extensively about how her interactions with the natural world developed her spiritual life. While pious in childhood, mostly because she had a crush on the minister, in adulthood, Goodall points to two moments where she felt deeply connected to transcendence. One was at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, a very traditional setting for transcendent experiences, where she walked in just as an organ began playing Bach and sat looking at the rose window. She described the experience as something close to mystical ecstasy, in which a sense of awe transported her beyond herself, and she found herself wrapped up in the beauty of the moment. The second happened in the forest. She describes it as a parallel experience to the one in Notre Dame, but this time she lay in the grass trying to dry out after getting caught in a rainstorm, and ended up listening with a great awareness to the sounds of the forest around her. The chimps communicating with each other, the bird song, the wind through the trees. Again, she describes the moment as taking her beyond her sense of self, instead intimately connected with and part of the world around her. In these vignettes, a close relationship with the environment and with animals in particular, a relationship that I venture to call friendship, leads toward better scientific and theological or spiritual understanding of our relationship to the earth. I fully own that I say this as a theologian and an ethicist, and not as a scientist. And indeed, my goals here are primarily theological ones. But theology also needs to dialogue with scientific information about the natural world if our eco-theologies are to be robust and meaningful. Goodall's experience of doing research through relationship and the common theological argument that relationship undergirds what it means to be human suggests a way toward understanding science and religion as much more connected, as opposed to the way that they are often placed in binary opposition. I argue that developing an intersectional feminist approach to friendship, a category that is largely underdeveloped in both theology and scientific methods, can enliven this two-sided ecological connection. We already talk about being eco-friendly, so why not continue to unpack what friendship really is and what that means for being human? Further, if we assume a panentheistic understanding of God, the world becomes a primary connection to the divine, and fostering friendship with the earth, a way to develop friendship with God. Usually when I do interdisciplinary work, I begin with the scientific knowledge and then take that as a point of theological reflection. That's not quite what I'm doing here. Rather, I want to talk about friendship as a possible shared point of departure for both theology and science. As a theologian, I find friendship to have deep theological import and implications. But scientific study, especially studies in natural science, might also benefit from taking a posture of friendship toward the earth. And indeed, science has benefited from people like Goodall who have taken such an approach. And so since I'm sort of going at this in a new way, I'm also really looking forward to the discussion afterward. So I'll divide my lecture into two parts. The first will discuss the theology of friendship and why I believe that friendship is the key kind of relationship through which to understand our human and divine connections. The second will return to Goodall's journey as a scientist, naturalist, and advocate to further unpack the meaning of friendship in ecological practice. And by way of conclusion, we'll turn to implications for how to understand the divine in the world if friendship is our primary relational lens. So part one, a theology of friendship. Theology has taken up the human person's inherent relationality, marriage, and family life from systematic, ecclesiological, and ethical angles, and even relationships of solidarity with unnamed global strangers as subjects of reflection. While friendship, meanwhile, has remained in the background of relationships that theological discourse tends to forefront. Mary Hunt recognized this strange lack in 1991 when she wrote, "Everyone has friends, but by reading contemporary theology, no one would ever know it." We can only add to this sense of strangeness when we consider the kinds of relationships seen in the Gospels. Jesus appears to be fairly ambivalent about kinship relationships. For instance, who are my mother and brothers? But asserts that there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Indeed, most of what we read about Jesus in the Gospels is set within the context of him being with his friends. Not much has been added to the theological discussion on friendship in the more than 3 decades since Mary Hunt wrote Fierce Tenderness. Drawing largely on Hunt then, as well as Mary Daly, Brenna Moore, and Sally McFaig, I argue that friendship is well worth our theological attention for at least 3 reasons. It is a relationship that is a near universal experience, even more so than familial relationships. Many people have no family for a myriad of reasons, or a broken family, but nearly everyone has a friend. Further, many people live full lives without relationships to blood relatives, but being without friendship tends to be a real hindrance to flourishing and a sign of other problems. 2, even when we do speak of family, friendship is often a basis of healthy spousal relationships, and perhaps even parent-child relationships. And 3, friendship has vast social, ethical, and political implications. So why come at this subject from an intersectional feminist perspective? To put it perhaps too plainly, women are really good at friendship. While images like that of mean girls are readily available in popular discourse when we think about women's relationships with each other, women also have a deep and abiding love for their female friends, which is cultivated from a very early age. This has remained true across many times and cultures. Carol Smith Rosenberg's study of letters between Victorian women found that they were often effusive in describing their love for each other. One such letter, for instance, reads, and I quote, "I can give you no idea how desperately I shall want you." In response, her friend writes, again quoting, "Dear darling Sarah, how I love you and how happy I have been. You are the joy of my life. I cannot tell you how much happiness you gave me, nor how constantly it is all in my thoughts. My darling, how I long for the time when I shall see you." End quote. Friendships between women are also generally not plagued by a fear of being mistaken as gay, or at least not nearly to the extent that men's friendships are. And so we see this kind of effusive language between women. A key piece of feminist epistemology is that it centers human experience, emotion, and care as legitimate ways of knowing. It is particularly because these female friendships provide a well of experiential knowledge to which theology has not paid much attention that we have a fourth reason why friendship should matter to theology. To use Hunt's words, women's friendships, because they have not been considered rigorously before, allow a fresh approach to theologizing. Because it is fresh, we can consider friendship without some of the patriarchal, colonial, and racist baggage that we find in the histories of many of our theological categories. What I offer here are some initial reflections on what insights from women's friendships can tell us about ourselves as political, relational, and interdependent beings. So 1, friendship is political. Mary Hunt, Mary Daly, and Brenna Moore all recognize friendship as a political act. At one level, this is because friendship can indeed be geared toward the political sphere, justice, and social change. In the US, friendship between political activists, broadly construed, has played a key role in civil rights and feminist movements. For instance, the friendship between Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady in the 1930s and 40s, and Pauli Murray, a lawyer, poet, and Episcopal priest, had a formative effect on both their approaches to social transformation. For Murray's part, Roosevelt helped her understand the minutiae and nuance of changing legislation, while Murray pushed Roosevelt to become more progressive and urgent in advocating for civil rights. Friend relationships very often become a locus for engaging the political sphere, and people who work toward justice together often become friends. But there's another layer in which friendship between women is political without even meaning to be, because it creates a space that resists patriarchal norms and expectations. Mary Daly, while perhaps infamously radical, not to mention creative with words, strikes a real chord when speaking about female friendship. She writes that, quote, "The radical friendship of hags," which she means in a positive way, means loving our own freedom, loving/encouraging the freedom of the other, the friend, and therefore loving freely, end quote. This kind of freedom in relationship is not only life-giving for women, but because it is life-giving and is so without men, it is threatening to a patriarchal institution. Quoting her again, "This secret alliance of beings, women, who are of a different planet is of another order. It challenges the caste of planetary proprietors by ignoring them. The bonding of threadless hags is dreadful. The result of this union is nemesis." I told you she was creative with words. By which she means that female friendships become a nemesis to the patriarchal order. For Hunt, this is why discussions among women are often dismissed as gossip or girl talk. Brenna Moore's study of spiritual friendships in the 20th century demonstrates the theological import of this layer of political implication. While again friendship was central to mid-20th century Catholic activism, friend groups also provided an alternative to the social and theological assertion that the nuclear family was the best way to live, or even the only valid arrangement of social relationship. For people such as Ray Samaritan, Simone Weil, and Marie Magdalene Davy, friendship offered a support system on the margins of Catholicism, where they both tried to escape the strict gender roles that Catholicism promoted and tried to live with the distinctly Catholic spirituality of their own discovery. In particular, female friendship offers women an alternative to relationships based in patriarchal structures that drain women by demanding we sacrifice our energy and well-being for the sake of husbands, children, and society. Feminist theologians, and especially those who are women of color, have been critical of theological systems which name self-sacrifice as a characteristic particular to women for well over a century now. An unbalance in how the burden of self-sacrifice is placed on men and women is not new, and it also seems to have a perverse staying power despite regular criticism. In Changing the Questions, published in 2015, Margaret Farley challenges the potential falsification of these concepts of self-sacrifice and servanthood when they are tied to a pattern of submissiveness to men. In a 2014 essay, Coach Ronnie Abraham points toward the same patriarchal virtue theory as partially responsible for violence against women in India, writing that violence is tolerated thanks to their gendered socialization in the so-called feminine virtues of submission, self-sacrifice, and passivity. She points out that feminine virtue is the result of the Aristotelian idea of virtues as ideal character traits being warped by a patriarchal society in which men are the only ones who get to answer the questions, what is ideal and for whom? Women are expected to submit to the expectations of men and often suffer because of them for the sake of the well-being of the family or in order to live up to the standard set for an ideal woman. Again, this is why Daly asserts that friendships between women are so threatening to a patriarchal system. Women are not pressured to sacrifice their selfhood or flourishing for their female friends, but rather women gain fulfillment, self-understanding, identity, and generativity from friendship. A woman who experiences this is not so likely to lose themselves amid patriarchal expectations, and given the right circumstances, perhaps less likely to care about patriarchal expectations at all. 2, friendship can be toxic. This is something of a short aside, but I want to acknowledge that not all friendships are net positive experiences. Not all people are good for each other, and that includes friendships along with familial or spousal relationships. This can include codependence, cycle of conflict, and superficial reconciliation, teaming up against others, and bringing out each other's worst qualities rather than the best. We bring not only regular human sinfulness, but human finitude and trauma into our relationships, and this can go wrong in a myriad of ways. If you've somehow managed to escape experiencing or being witness to this kind of friendship in your life, we can always think about Mean Girls again as a model, or a plethora of other media depictions of malicious behavior between female friends. I also want to acknowledge that while not exactly a matter of toxicity, the category of friendship can bring baggage for members of the LGBTQ+ community who have often been forced to refer to romantic partners as, quote, just friends for the sake of safety or acceptance. 3, friendship is challenged by and can overcome injustice. Connected to the political nature of friendship is the fact that just as our social sphere is affected by various forms of injustice, so too are our friendships. Structures of injustice like racism, sexism, homophobia, and colonialism can get in between friends, serve as a point of connection for friends, or bring friends together who work together against those structures. Scholars Jessica C.M. Fernandez, Kara Hisatake, and Angela Nguyen discussed friendship in the context of Maria Lugones's decolonial notion of world traveling. They come to the subject from the perspectives of social psychology, ethnic studies, and literature, but also as friends themselves, who are able to reflect academically together on their shared experiences. Lugones's world traveling is set up in opposition to the touristic, middle to upper class kind of traveling that we might be more familiar with, which she regards as perpetuating the colonial logic of domination and its goals to see and conquer. Rather, world traveling, world is in quotes, entails stepping into the world of another through attentive listening. And Fernandez, Hisatake, and Nguyen assert that this is a key element of their friendship that exists in the shadow of colonialism and at the gap of the colonial difference. Through storytelling, hanging out, and being playful, they visit each other's worlds. As they put it, hanging out embodies a different relationship to people and worlds. Its openness and flexibility make it an act against oppression and knowing the other as traveling tourists and conquerors. It is not always a comfortable experience, as traveling to another's world can evoke tension with one's own. But all in all, these scholars propose it as an effective way to cultivate and navigate friendship in the shadow of unjust histories. 4, even if it's not toxic, friendship is nonetheless conflictual. The descriptions of reality found in theology, especially in my own realm of Catholic theology, tend to paint a picture of harmony and order in the world and in human relationships, which is occasionally interrupted by bouts of disharmony caused by sinfulness and a fallen world. In some instances, it's surprising to find an acknowledgement of conflict at all. Some ethicists have begun to challenge a view of the world in which conflict is an idiosyncratic blip, instead pointing to the inevitability of conflict and social change. Other ethicists, mainly Methodist theologian Ellen Ott Marshall and Mennonite peace-building scholar John Paul Lederach, place conflict at the core of theological anthropology by centering the conflictual potential of persons that are both autonomous and interrelated. As a sociologist by training, Lederach claims that the narrative of creation and Genesis offers 3 truths about the nature of human beings: that we're made in the image of God and thus contain the presence of God within us, that humans are created with diversity in being created male and female, and that humans have freedom, as evidenced by the first human's choice to disobey God's wishes. Together, these traits make for a dynamic mix out of which conflict arises. And importantly, humans were purposefully created by God that way. Similarly, Marshall observes that we exist as individuals who are different from each other but inhabit shared and changing ecosystems. We're both autonomous and interrelated. For her, these are both descriptive and normative claims. Descriptive because on one hand, it's a simple observation that we are different beings, and that sometimes puts us in conflict with one another. On the other hand, she argues that conflict is also a normative aspect of humanity, since our autonomy and interrelatedness are claims about who and how we are meant to be as human persons. And since we can only live fully into our personhood with both characteristics, we therefore should be in conflict. In other words, being in conflict is a sign that we are being properly and fully human. Conflict's normative nature means that not only is it something that we do experience, but something that we ought to experience. I argue, and Marshall would likely agree, that this is not necessarily a condition of every moment in a person's life, but a broader orientation of what it means to be human. In other words, if a person is not experiencing some kind of conflict at every single moment of their life, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not living fully into their humanity, and it's probably a good thing, honestly. However, if a person never experiences conflict or only does so on rare occasion, they're not likely to be living out a fully autonomous and interconnected and therefore human existence. So if conflict is a normative aspect of human relationship, so too are friendships sometimes conflictual if they are deep enough relationships to encompass the full humanity of everyone involved. We all probably have firsthand knowledge of this. It is different than speaking about toxic friendships because conflict itself is not inherently toxic, but rather the way that we approach conflict can be. Moreover, friends working through conflict reveals a kind of commitment to the relationship that is unique to friendship. Because these people are not legally bound to each other, they often don't live or work together. There are often no external constraints that make the conflict worth working out, other than the value of the friend relationship itself. This is why Sally McFague calls friendship the most disinterested form of love. It leads us to appreciation of another's uniqueness and value without so much interest in what we get back from the relationship. 5 out of 6. Friendship is anthropological. This leads us to consider a feminist theology of friendship as offering a holistic view of theological anthropology as an alternative to anthropologies built around patriarchal assumptions. The point of feminist epistemology is that feminist ways of knowing are not just valid for women, but contain real truths. And so such an anthropology should be considered universally legitimate, at least to the extent that any theology can be universal. Feminist reflection recasts friendship as a value in itself, rather than as a waypoint on the road to heterosexual marriage. It also provides a model of relationship that does not revolve around reproduction, at least not in a biological sense, and that does not depend on gender complementarity. Using what she calls a spiral method for theology, in which dynamics don't just repeat themselves in a circle, but pick up more as they go around, Hunt offers 4 themes that characterize a feminist reading of friendship: love, power, embodiment, and spirituality. First, women friends demonstrate a real love for each other, which, as seen in those Victorian letters, elides sharp distinctions between platonic and romantic love. The love of friendship wants the best for one's friends, but is also mutually enriching and freely given. Quoting Hunt here, an orientation toward the world as if my friend and I were more united than separated, more at one among the many than separate and alone. Second, described simply as the ability to choose for oneself, power describes both positive and negative dynamics between friends and the social structures in which they are seated. Power shapes the realities of friendships, and friendships hold the ability to empower those involved. Third, embodiment describes the fact that all experiences are mediated through the body. Further, female friends are often physically affectionate, from braiding each other's hair at slumber parties to cuddling up for a movie night to holding a friend who's grieving. Fully embodied relationship is a fundamental element of being human, and the physicality of women's friendships challenges homophobic assumptions about how people of the same sex should physically relate. Finally, Hunt defines spirituality somewhat idiosyncratically as making choices about the quality of life for oneself and for one's community, based in the conviction that religious impulses toward meaning are expressed concretely. All this together expresses a core of human being and becoming that is available to everyone, and that is also flexible and plural enough to account for many forms of relationship. It does not assert one right way to be a friend, but gives us a broad model through which to understand the human person as innately relational and political. And sixth, friendship is theological. Finally, Hunt asserts that friendship does not just reveal something about the self and about others, but that, quote, friendship is the most adequate relational referent for the divine human relationship. Quoting again, as in all women's friendships, the potential for nurture and nastiness, comfort and challenge resides in all divine human relationships. Sally McFaig also asserts that God as friend is the most adult of the God world models because it communicates our responsibility and agency in the relationship. Unlike parental models in which we are children or imperial models in which we are obedient subjects, friendship as a model for God posits us as responsible actors in the world with the ability to decide what kinds of relationships we want to foster with each other, God, and the environment. As McFaig also points out, C.S. Lewis once warned against using friend as a metaphor for God because he thought friend was such an apt description for God that it ran the risk of leading people to take the symbol too literally. So what would it look like to think not only of God as a woman, but as a female friend? Returning to the feminist challenge to impose self-sacrifice, a feminist theology of friendship emphasizes God as a friend in a mutually life-giving relationship, rather than as a supreme being who demands obfuscation of oneself. Rather than just the recipients of divine direction, friends of God are partners in creative and decision-making processes. And to quote Hunt once more, in each friendship we are brought face to face with ourselves, with one another, and with a larger world in which the mysterious forces of attraction work beyond our ultimate control. I would really hope that all of us have had such a relationship. By forefronting women's experiences, a feminist theology of friendship offers a mode of being that promotes both individual identity and embodied relationship with others. This is different than what Daly identifies as the patriarchal model of fraternity between male friends, in which the goal is to lose oneself to the collective. It instead calls us to see and accept what she calls the divine spark in oneself and in others. When I think about my own friendships, the desire to balance our individuality and relationality seems like a misnomer, because in good, healthy friendships, we become more ourselves in relation to our friends, just as we know and appreciate our friends as themselves. This kind of love should be what's the model for our relationality. Though theological reflection on friendship has somehow remained in its infancy for over 30 years, one of my hopes is that what I offer here might be seeds for more robust engagement with a near universal experience. But for now, we'll turn to what this might mean for becoming friends with the earth. So let's return to Jane Goodall. And this part is going to have some storytelling, but perhaps that's appropriate for a mid-afternoon lecture. Although she does not generally use the word friend to describe the animals she has come to know and love, I struggle to find another word that fully conveys how she describes her relationship with them. In one online interview, she points the camera around her attic office in the home where she grew up, and there are several photographs on the shelves. They contain human and non-human acquaintances alike. She goes around introducing the figures in the photos, and next to a picture of her mother is a picture of the first chimpanzee who ever trusted her in Gombe, who she calls David Greybeard. Her childhood dog, Rusty, stands across from a photo of her son, and so on. The way she speaks of her non-human companions certainly seems to fit within Hunt's description of friendly love, that orientation toward the world as if my friend and I were more united than separated, more at one among the many than separate and alone. You can see her appreciation for the uniqueness of each. As we do with our friends, Goodall also accepts who each animal is as a member of a non-human species and as an individual. She's careful not to anthropomorphize, but to allow empathy to form the basis of scientific inquiry, and sometimes to reluctantly admit that apes are more human-like than we'd hope. In her memoir, she recounts a time when a brutal conflict broke out between factions in a group of chimpanzees, resulting in one faction completely wiping out the other. It was something like war, and an unfortunate revelation that humans share a darker side with our ape relatives as well. But she also writes about how her relationship with the chimpanzee mothers changed after she had a child of her own, leading her to a new level of understanding and even some parenting tips. Goodall's friend-like relational approach to scientific study led to important scientific discoveries and also to early activism around environmental degradation, animal dignity, and climate change, when she ultimately shifted her career from fieldwork and teaching to giving lectures and working on public policy around the world. So what I'd like to do here is look at our ecological relationships through the lens of friendship that I've just developed, taking Goodall as a model for the scientific and humanistic value of doing so. I argue that many of the aspects of friendship that appear when we look at it theologically also apply to our relationships with the natural world. My home country, the US, is probably the example par excellence of how science is political and politicized. Our federal and state governments often make decisions not only in ignorance of scientific evidence, but in direct opposition to advice from scientific experts. Scientific studies give ample evidence that vaccines are safe. Politicians still amplify suspicions about them. Science overwhelmingly agrees that the climate is warming at a devastating rate and that this will be detrimental to life as we know it. US politicians, some of them, countered that the climate has always changed and that global warming cannot possibly be real because their city just had a snowstorm. One way in which ecological friendship is political is that implementing eco-friendly actions usually requires governments to make policies in order to be widely effective. But the relationship between science and policy is not straightforward. For instance, Stephanie L. Witt asserts that, quote, environmental justice is an area in which science and policy speak different languages. Science speaks in terms of correlations, probabilities, and the assumption of neutrality. For example, there's a correlation between the location of environmental hazards and minority communities. Policy speaks in terms of certainty and causation. For example, living near hazard X results in disease Y, and so Z should be done about it, end quote. These difficulties become even larger when there are also political actors who are operating in bad faith, when scientific literacy and trust in science itself is politicized. Eco-friendliness also involves attending to environmental problems in connection with people problems. When Goodall first forayed into ameliorating chimpanzee habitat loss, she discovered that deforestation was tied to crippling poverty, which itself is largely due to the aftermath of colonialism. This is probably not as much of a surprise to us as it was to a British woman in 1994. And it probably was not a surprise to the people of Africa then. But the novel part of Goodall's work with her foundation was that someone from a privileged part of the world who witnessed ecological problems and had the resources to fix them went and asked the people who lived there what they needed. I don't want to romanticize the context in which Goodall was operating. One of the reasons she was able to go to what is now Tanzania in the first place is likely the fact that the area was still technically under British colonial control. But in the midst of this structural violence, and when many organizations were still taking paternalistic approaches to the global south, the Jane Goodall Institute provided resources for agriculture, medical care, and education based on what the people living in rural areas told them their needs were. A posture of something like friendship, rather than paternalism, allowed the two groups to be partners in developing solutions. They developed methods of farming that utilized the shade of the trees rather than methods that necessitated clearing them. Importantly, they were also particularly attentive to the needs of women and girls, first installing sanitary facilities in schools so that girls would be able to finish their educations, and then setting up a system for microloans that helps women in particular start up sustainable businesses. This attention to the intersection of poverty and gender proved essential to reforesting the area and reinvigorating the ecosystem. Ecological activity is at once scientific, political, and ethical. It also challenges the still popular notion that taking care of people should take priority over any ecological concern, though, of course, again, ethnic minority communities in the US and Europe have understood the connection between social and ecological justice for a long time, as with the insight that minority communities tend to have greater medical issues because of their disproportionate proximity to pollution and toxic waste sites. Generally speaking, we are much more dependent on the environment than the environment is on us, and taking steps towards sustainable ecological practices ultimately leads to better outcomes for human communities as well. Finally, as with friendship between women, friendship with the earth is political because it is a posture that entails resistance to systems of consumerism and colonialism. Which leads us to talk about the second point here, that ecological friendship is mired in injustice. Eco-womanism is particularly helpful for grasping the extent and complex interlocking of unjust structures as they relate to the environment. As Melanie Harris puts it, just as women of color have survived multiple forms of oppression when confronting racism, classism, sexism, and heterosexism, androcentric attitudes devaluing the earth and privileging particular humans over the earth's well-being has resulted in the environmental crisis in which we all find ourselves, end quote. She asserts that not only does the natural world suffer under the same logics of domination that dehumanize people with certain kinds of bodies, elements of the natural world have also been used in dynamics of oppression, such as the lynching tree or the cotton fields. And yet there is also a unique connection between Black women and other women of color and the earth. As I read her, Harris does not mean this in an essentializing way that posits women as inherently more earthy than men. Rather, women of color in particular have retained cultural traditions and epistemologies that highlight the interdependent relationship that we all have with the natural world, but acknowledge to higher or lesser degrees, and also experience the detriments of that interdependence to a greater extent when the environment suffers. I don't want to spend a lot more time unpacking the ways in which humanity, or at least the humanity that mainly lives in the US and Europe, has done injustice to the earth, because I don't think I need to convince this audience of that point. But adopting a posture of ecological friendship can point toward ways to build a more just relationship with the earth, even in the midst of structural injustice. In particular, the idea of world traveling that's expounded by Fernandez, Satake, and Nguyen might be paralleled here. If decolonial friendship requires the kind of empathetic listening that allows us to step into another's world, then perhaps becoming friends with the earth entails the same kind of empathy and attention. To some extent, listening to the earth requires us also to listen to natural scientists who can do some translating. The cry of the earth, so to speak, cannot necessarily be understood by untrained ears. But Fernandez, Hisatake, and Nguyen also maintain that world traveling is not just done through speech, but by hanging out, a process that lends itself to saturation of being in the present, listening and sharing, without the social scientific objective search for facts about each other. Though I don't want to denigrate urban spaces, which often provide the support to live with less ecological impact than in some suburban or rural areas, I can't help but wonder if we might be better ecological friends if we spent more time being present to nature, as Goodall's time in the forest seems to have done for her. Nature still happens in cities too, after all. Third, ecological friendship is conflictual. I'm not here to claim that being friends with the earth is all sunshine and rainbows. Like human relationships, our relationship with the earth is also caught up in competing goals, destructive tendencies on both sides, and sometimes more than a little chaotic energy. Scientific understandings of natural processes can help us unpack what relationship with such a world entails, given that many ecological processes depend upon decay, destruction, and death in order to function. Some of these destructive events, especially hurricanes, floods, and droughts, are a result of anthropogenic climate change. But other occurrences of natural destruction are built into the system. These processes might include the carbon cycle, food webs, and evolution, among others. So let's look at one of these examples, food webs. We're going to get real sciencey here for a minute. A food web is a system of interlocking food chains within an ecosystem. Rather than tracing one line from predators down to fungi as in a chain, food webs reflect the reality that many consumers, producers, and decomposers interact in a more complicated system. This accounts for some of the danger talked about with the loss of biodiversity. The disappearance of one species can have deleterious effects on the stability of an entire ecosystem, not just a chain of the 3 or 4 other species below them. Food webs and chains are divided into trophic levels, which are categorized according to species' role in the web. The first trophic level is that of producers or species that produce their own food, like plants, which are thus referred to as autotrophs. Generally, these include plants, algae, phytoplankton, and some types of bacteria. At the second level are consumers, or those species which exist by eating other species, which includes herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. The last trophic level is made up of decomposers, which subsist on non-living plant and animal matter, for example, vultures, thereby releasing nutrients back into the ecosystem. The stability of food webs depends upon the death and decay of organisms in order to continue the lives of others. But human intervention can also lead to more destruction than the food web can handle. Trophic levels are measured in terms of biomass, and in a healthy food web, biomass decreases as the trophic levels increase to create a pyramid-like structure so that there's more autotrophs than primary consumers, and so forth. When biomass in one trophic level is altered, which often happens as a result of human activity, it creates what's referred to as a cascade effect. For instance, deforestation and the corresponding spread in urban and suburban environments in the US has impacted the population of top-level predators like gray wolves and mountain lions, which have wider-ranging habitats than primary consumers and are thus more affected by deforestation. These kinds of predators are also more likely to be felt as a threat to humans, especially farmers of livestock, and are thus hunted and expelled from environments that are inhabited by humans. Without being kept in check by wolves, deer populations then explode, and in turn results in overconsumption of vegetation, which also affects leaf litter, arthropods, breeding birds, and soil nutrients. One of the most significant projects of ecological recovery for this reason that's been taken in both the US and Europe is to reintroduce wolves back into the natural environment. And in this way, re-implementing a destructive force like this can be crucial to maintaining the viability of an ecosystem. Being friends with a world in which destruction plays a crucial part is complicated and occasionally dangerous. Just like our relationships with other people, conflict is a normative element of our relationship with the natural world. Ecological friendship is not just about going out and spending time reconnecting with nature without acknowledging the real conflicts between humans, other species, and catastrophic weather events, though reconnection can be important. Instead, it's about taking a friendly posture toward the natural world that's capable of understanding nature on its own terms and doing what we can to help it flourish, being sure that our conflicting goals have as little deleterious effect as possible, and amending our over-destruction where necessary. So in conclusion, if you'll bear with me, I have one more story. Around the same time that Goodall began observing wild chimpanzees, a group of Orthodox monks in upstate New York started breeding and training German shepherds. Initially, the community had only one dog who provided a core to the community. When that dog died, the resulting emptiness led the monks to begin their breeding program, which became not only a means of financial stability, but a way for the monks to deepen their relationships with each other and with God. As one monk, Brother Luke, puts it, quote, "One of the things that a dog teaches us is about God. Forgiveness and love and connection, those are attributes of God. In the rough and tumble of life, we don't always exhibit God's love as well as the dog does." I'm not so concerned here with giving a theological argument for why panentheism is the correct way or most correct way to understand God's relationship to the world. Others, some of them at this conference, like Lena, have done that already and will do that brilliantly. What I'm more concerned with by way of closing is to reflect on the next step, what it means for our theological and scientific relationship to the natural world if we take panentheism as a given, if we assume that our ecological interactions are also interactions with the divine. The monks of New Skete understand this implicitly when they learn about God from dogs. How might a presumed panentheism coupled with a posture of friendship change our theology? Or if I'm being a little edgy, how might it change the way we do science? Panentheism implies that we can encounter the divine in the natural world and learn about God from it. Whether the part of the natural world at hand is a forest or a rainstorm, a chimpanzee, or a dog. Advocating for a panentheistic theology, Elizabeth Johnson writes that, quote, "Panentheism entails a kind of asymmetrical mutual indwelling, not of two equal partners, but of the infinite God who dwells within all things, sparking them into being, and finite creatures who dwell within the embrace of divine love. In truth, since God in principle does not have any spatial attributes, this is a metaphor whose end expresses the intimacy of relation in an ontological sense," end quote. She goes on to quote Dennis Edwards, who argues that no one creature, not even the human, can image God by itself. Only the diversity of life can give expression to the radical diversity and otherness of the Trinitarian God. Scientific study is therefore a salient point of theological reflection, as understanding more about the world in which God dwells leads to a greater understanding of God. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, theologians, really everyone who's not a scientist, who regard the earth as a friend, and are therefore curious about who or what the natural world is and want to get to know it better, depend on science to help us translate. I don't think science necessarily needs to mirror this disciplinary relationship. Natural science in general might actually be better at than theology at treating the earth like a friend already, as it proceeds from a position of curiosity, and it tries not to make assumptions, but to understand the natural world on its own terms. But there are insights from theology that science and scientists might find useful: a sense of wonder and appreciation of mystery, and a non-anthropocentric worldview that instead posits humans as fellow creatures in a community of creation, for instance. We might also take Hunt's 4 elements of friendship: love, power, embodiment, and spirituality, as points of theological and scientific reflection on the world. We humans, for instance, are the beings who have the most freedom to decide how we interact with the world. In the last few centuries especially, that ability to decide has been detrimental. But we also have the power to make different decisions, to see ourselves again as co-creators who work in partnership and friendship with God to help the whole community of creation flourish. And finally, adopting a posture of friendship toward the earth can serve as a shared point of departure for interdisciplinary work. Though science aspires to value neutrality, scientific studies also have specific motivations: to cure disease, to affect public policy, or to slow down climate change. Those motivations help scientists see certain things that they might not if they were only there for the sake of gaining knowledge. When it comes to ecological studies, theologians and ethicists share many of those same motivations. Again, while I own that I speak as a theologian and ethicist and not as a scientist, it seems to me that both an eco-theology that draws on scientific study to place us squarely as part of the environment, and the example of science like that done by Jane Goodall that has led to scientific insight by proceeding from relationship with the natural world, demonstrates that in both theology and science, we don't need to be quite so afraid of having empathy with our subjects of study, or acknowledging our innate relationships with them. And we might become better friends of the earth and better friends of God for it. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Taylor. I think a really interesting and thought-provoking paper, particularly considering that friendship relational model from a theological perspective as well. I think that's really interesting. And yeah, how that might change the sort of paternalist approach that kind of traditionally absorb and go, this is what a relationship looks like. There's one question that's come through on the chat, and then I'll go to Paul, who I can see got his hand up. So the question in the chat is, how does our evolutionary and ecological connection with all things modify our ability to be friends in any neutral sense rather than philia, agape, or eros? Would a storge, a sort of family affection, be a better description? This would also reflect our union or participation with God according to panentheism. If you want anything clarifying, I will let Andrew stick his mic on.
How about I have a go, and then if I've misunderstood something, Andrew can clarify. So, I actually don't think we have the ability to be friends in a neutral sense. I think the fact that we are so interdependent with the environment and with each other, there's no view from nowhere, and that interdependence places us in a particular starting point, places us in particular relationships. And so how we approach those relationships can't be neutral. We're already starting from somewhere. And so I think actually turning to feminist epistemology to look at friendship sort of blurs the lines between these traditional kinds of love, philia, agape, eros. For instance, these Victorian women basically writing love letters to each other, even though they're friends, really blurs the lines between eros and philia. I think if we look at female friendships as they are, yeah, those lines don't necessarily play out, or those differentiations between forms of love don't necessarily play out in reality. So yeah, if you want to add something.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Taylor. Paul, and then Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that talk. I think that's the best talk I've heard on those areas ever, I think. I'm a biologist who then became a theologian. I'm a Methodist minister, but I had 18 years in biology and studying research and teaching. And I studied animal behavior in the early 1970s. And I was fascinated by it, but I wouldn't do research in it. It objectified. This is pre-Goodall. I think all the people I knew, and if you think of Nico Timberg and Konrad Lorenz and all the people involved, they were men. And I think I suppose Lorenz went nearer to having relationships. The bit that revolted me was actually comparative psychology, which I really couldn't do. This is the science where you take the animal into an artificial environment, and you then look at the artificial behavior using positive and negative stimulations, which actually means hurting and rewarding. A lot of the things, Skinner's boxes, Pavlov's dogs is nastier than it's normally presented. Sutures, they didn't take drops of saliva, they put sutures through the cheek and all the rest of it. And I suppose I've got lots of questions, but one of them would be about ownership of land, ownership of animals. Interestingly, I don't think I knew an animal behavior specialist with a pet dog. Not other botany. In fact, I became a botanist largely, and I have a pet dog, and botanists do. But and Goodall didn't go through the normal procedure. She wasn't a trained animal behaviorist at all. And so she ignored all that. And yes, and I remember the reaction to her doing it. But I was thinking of the relationship to land. I have friends from South Africa and so on, who will talk about the relationship with land quite differently from a Western European. So could you comment on the concept of ownership of land, ownership of resources? I later did a PhD on lichens and air pollution. And since being a minister, I've written reports on climate change. But can you comment on the concept of ownership? Can one own land? My African friends would say that you belong to the land.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, that's fascinating. Your background, and one of my teachers at Fordham was Christiana Zenner, who also was a biologist who became a theologian, and so I really appreciate that trajectory. Yes, and that's also why I find Goodall such a fascinating figure, is that she did the field work and then she got her PhD.
Yeah.
And she really talks about how if she had done it the other way around, the training that we go through in developing a worldview might have been so strong that she would not have seen the kinds of things that she did. And so, yeah, I think she's a fascinating figure in many ways. That is one of them. On the question of ownership, yeah, I also have a dog, and I have often thought about this sort of turn of phrase of saying I own a dog, because do I really own my dog? I'm not sure. I think she might have different feelings about it. I think we have a relationship. I have a relationship with my dog, or I have a dog who lives with me, or something like that. But yeah, this sort of tendency to put everything in terms of ownership that comes from Western ways of thinking and goes back several centuries has really affected, I think, our ability to view ourselves in interdependent relationship with the environment and with various parts of the environment. So yeah, I think non-Western or spiritualities that come from the not from the Northwestern hemisphere are really vital and crucial in that sense, that they give us a different way to envisage our relationship with the land. Because I think, saying that we belong to the land is probably more accurate. As I mentioned, like we depend on the environment a lot more than the environment depends on us.
Mm.
The environment will go on being the environment if we're gone. It won't go the other way around. So I think recovering some of these alternative epistemologies really is really vital.
We had in the post-medieval, we had the enclosures in England and the Highland clearances later, which changed the relationship. For instance, persuading the clan chiefs that they weren't simply the people who looked after their people on the land, but they owned the land, and the result was they turfed them off the land, put sheep there instead. Earlier, it had happened in England with the enclosures, where common land was enclosed, whereas people had rights to it, and they were forced into urbanization.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose they didn't happen in Ireland until you had the potato famines.
I bet it's a really good question, Paul, though, because you wouldn't even consider saying I own my friendship. Like it just that the minute you're talking in a friendship relation, I think it's completely different, and it completely changes. You just wouldn't say it. Picking up on what you were saying, Taylor, Leah's put in the comments that they're a wildlife conservationist turned spiritual ecologist. And if they hadn't completed their academic training in conservation, they imagine they would have worked very differently with nature from the outset, rather than 20 years later. So yeah, I think definitely speaking to a common thought. Paul, do you mind if I go on to Mike and Mehmet, and then if you've got other questions, you can come back in.
I'll come back.
Mike, sorry, I didn't mean to be so formal, being Michael earlier.
No, I think turning it off and on again does tend to do the trick, doesn't it? Anyway, good to be with you properly this time. Taylor, thank you so much. That was a really rich and very thought-provoking presentation. And one thing it put me in mind of was some years back now, Ruth Page coined the term panentheism, the idea of God with everything, speaking in terms of God companioning the created order, human beings and the created order more widely. And I just wondered if you felt there'd be resonances there with the kind of approach you're taking.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to read more about it to have a fuller answer, but off the top of my head, there's also theology that talks about God companioning us, as walking with us, especially liberation theologies that say, God is on the side of the poor, or God is on the side of the vulnerable, right? God is imagined as this companion, and not necessarily this, going back to our previous discussion, not like an intervening force, but as a companioning force. Yes, and so I think if we're going to say that God cares about not just humans, but the whole world, then yeah, I'm seeing God as a companion to all creation is a perfectly valid way to think about it.
Thanks. Ruth's book was called God and the Web of Creation, which I think, again, was another similarly helpful metaphor for understanding. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike. Mehmet, and apologies if I've said that wrong.
Yeah, hi. I'm joining from Germany. I'm from Turkey originally.
I was searching for a platform as a hobby, not part of my profession, but as a hobby to have a conversation, with people about religion and science and philosophy, especially. I was wondering the point where religion and philosophy meet. But this not exactly a philosophy, but religion and science. My comment about the presentation, it was a nice presentation. Is good to. I think it is very important to have women in these fields. They have, I believe, more positive attitude in communication and friendship. I really find it important. Also, the friendship between science and religion is very, I think, important, also crucial. The goal should be to establish a healthy friendship. But for this, what needs to be done on both sides? Which steps needs to be taken from science part, and which steps needs to be taken from religion side? I have my opinion, but I would like to. I don't know if, sorry if I have missed, if you already have mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is, what steps need to be taken on both sides to make this a better theology science relationship?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so coming at this primarily as an ethicist, I care less about the relationship between science and religion as such, as the crisis that faces us that requires both scientific and theological responses. And so, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of steps could be taken in all directions. For theologians, I think it's becoming more common to do interdisciplinary work and to really take scientists seriously, and to develop the ability to read scientific literature with more understanding. And that's really key to doing theology that, you know, can talk robustly about the natural world. As for science, you know, I can't talk from inside the guild, but yeah, I think there's room for maybe a little more wonder in there, and a little more self-awareness of the values that scientists bring with them. Not necessarily in a positive or negative way, just because we're all coming from somewhere, and we're necessarily going to understand the value of science and the values that weigh on science in certain ways.
Thank you.
Thanks, Taylor, and thanks for the question, Mehmet. There's one question that's coming in the chat, which I'm going to kind of expand slightly. So John's asked whether the internet or social media have devalued the term friend. I would like to expand this slightly to say, when we consider particularly around AI and that kind of wider technological definition of making friends with non-human, non-animal objects and so forth, does that become more challenging then if we're thinking about a friend relationship between us and God and the earth? Or is it just we're using friend wrong? I don't know, it might, yeah.
Wow, only the easy questions here.
Of course.
Yeah.
Like, that's what you want this time of the evening.
So, yes, I think, well, I think it really depends on the person using social media as to whether or not that's had the effect of devaluing the understanding of friends. I think maybe it's caused us to use the term friend a bit more broadly, whereas before we might have spoken more readily about, you know, this is my acquaintance or something like that. But if you really get down to it, I think most people still understand the difference between like real bosom buddy friends that they have and like those real deep friend relationships. And, you know, someone they went to high school with who they occasionally see post pictures on Facebook. Yeah, in terms of AI, I mean, I think, so my point is that friendship is such a readily available kind of relationship that we all sort of have experience with, and yeah, is available for everyone to sort of reflect on. It's a useful metaphor for, you know, how we should posture ourselves toward the environment, or toward the natural world. I suppose theoretically you could take that same kind of posture toward AI, or some kind of non-organic thing. I don't know that what you would get out of that posturing is the same. Or yeah, I mean, who knows where AI will go, right? If we end up with AI that's, you know, really conscious of itself and basically is another being, yeah, like, yeah, maybe we could be friends with it. And at this point, I think a posture of friendship has a really limited usage in that arena.
Brilliant, thanks. I think it was more I was thinking about the fact that I think people are more ready to ascribe friendship or a relational status to, you know, oh, I've just had an argument with ChatGPT, than perhaps they are with the natural world, which I think is an interesting, probably commentary on us as human beings. So yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions? Paul, go for it. I think you're the last one left. We've got a couple of minutes, so over to you.
Oh, a number of things. Well, I at one point I thought you were going close to Gaia theory of the 1980s, you know, and deep ecology.
Yeah.
But that was that more hierarchical and more aggressive and maybe more masculine than you were looking?
Gaia theory? So my main understanding of Gaia theory is sort of through the god/goddess theology or theory of the earth. And that's, yeah, that's not exactly where I want to go. And I also think it runs a real risk of exoticizing other cultures' ways of understanding the earth that are, you know, colonial in nature, and sort of operate under this logic of domination. And so, yeah, I tend to be very careful with that, with those ways of understanding the earth. There may be some overlap, but yeah, that's not quite where I'm going.
It was very aggressive, and the idea of saying that human beings were a disease on the earth and the earth would get rid of them, I don't think it was the people who were saying it who thought they'd be got rid of. It was the other people that wanted. So it was more than colonial.
Yeah.
At the time. I think it is interesting, if you don't mind. I studied theology at Durham 30 years ago. I mean, they're very nice to me because I arrived at 34, having been a scientist for 18 years and did a degree in 2 years. And they were puzzled by me and I by them to some extent as I charged through it. But when I sort of left biology at that stage, people thought I'd flipped. And it was a very anti-scientific thing to do, to become a Methodist minister.
Sure.
When I retired 5 years ago, I was amazed to be contacted by the Royal Society of Biology, and then amazed, well, about 2 years ago, when they said, why aren't you a fellow? And I said, well, you've never asked. And they said, well, what you did 30 years ago, you're a fellow from Monday. And that was a big surprise. And the attitude is different now, academically, you know. In fact, slightly more the scientists are more interested to some extent than the theologians are, I think.
Yeah. And, you know, I think part of that is probably because theologians and religious communities have really started to do the work. Lynn White's commentary on the history of Christianity, like, it's very trenchant and
but
very,
often misunderstood.
very relevant and very correct.
Yes, it's an internal critique, not an external one.
Right. But and so
It was written as a Christian, yeah.
right, and communities trying to move past that and really concretely moving past that by
Yeah,
taking actions, by like the things that Pope Francis has done,
yeah.
probably made biologists and other scientists a lot more theology friendly.
Thanks. Taylor, I'm going to take an executive decision and give it an extra 5 minutes because Leah and James have both had their hands up very patiently. What I might ask is if Leah and James, if you can both give your questions first, and then Taylor can respond to them. Is that all right? So Leah, if you go first.
Thank you. Mine's just a very quick comment, so don't worry. I think I mentioned in the chat, I've been a wildlife conservationist for many years and kind of turned into spiritual ecology. And as well as working with wildlife and nature reserves, I work a lot with young people and communities. And Taylor, I thought it was really interesting with the comment around friendship. I delivered some classes in personal social health education with some teenagers, and they range from ages 11 to 18. I did this for a few years, and I'd always ask the question in that, what is friendship? And it'd go straight to Facebook. Oh, I've got like 500 friends, 600 friends, I've got loads of friends. And then when you dig deeper, what really is a friend? And I just thought a beautiful outcome of that work was a lot of the young people would say, well, and it's not beautiful in a way because it shows the social structures of what we're going through, but it is also beautiful on a nature connection level, is, oh, well, my dog, my cat is my best friend because they're there for me every day. And they respond to me when I'm emotional or when I'm sad or when I need support. They're there for me to talk with without judgment. So I just wanted to throw that in around the friendship side and to say thank you so much because these conversations are so important around nature. So thank you, Taylor, and everyone.
Thanks,
Over and
Leah.
out.
Thanks for sharing. James.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor, for the great talk, and thanks, Finley, for organizing this. So, Taylor, you actually you foreshadowed my talk, which is going to happen in 15 minutes or so. So stay tuned for that. So you mentioned the cry of the earth, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my presentation as well. But the cry of the earth comes parallel with the cry of the poor as well in Laudato Si. So I wonder how you would prioritize between the two, and whether you think there's a necessity to prioritize between the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and whether the cry of the earth includes various. I mean, what does it include? Does it include all living things? Does it include the universe? Does it include cosmological arguments that we could possibly intervene in just by, sending out satellites or something? And does the cry of the poor also include marginalized and disadvantaged communities who we need to care for and nurture? And so what does the extent of that statement mean to you is really my question.
Okay, so both really rich questions, but I'll try to respond quickly. So first, that's super interesting about how teenagers are understanding the word friends. After having been influenced by social media for most of their adolescence and growing up, yeah, it would be really interesting to do like more empirical work on how that's all working out. On the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, I don't think they can be prioritized one after the other. And coming from Leonardo Boff, who's writing from Latin America, like he's seeing that these two things go together. And if we're speaking practically about how to address certain things, I think you have to address the people problems first, but that's only because they're interdependent and because you can't get people to like go plant trees if they're struggling to feed their families, right? But then like there's this there's this thing that grows upon itself because of our interdependence between social problems and ecological problems, where once you start solving one, the other comes along, and they sort of go back and forth. Yeah, and so I think we could see honestly the Earth as one of the poor or one of the vulnerable communities. And yeah, it has to go hand in hand.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna have to cut the conversation off, but really appreciate it, Taylor. Another massive virtual round of applause for the talk. Thank you ever so much.